Welcome to Divcasts from the University of Chicago Divinity School. For more of our podcasts and information about our terms of use, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's my honor and my pleasure, on behalf of the Divinity School, to introduce Professor Christoph Markschies and to welcome him to the University of Chicago Divinity School yet again after a workshop at Habilitation yesterday. Christoph Markschies holds the Harnack Chair in Church History and Ancient Christianity at the Humboldt-Universität Berlin, where he also served as the president of the university from 2006 to 2010. Professor Markschies studied theology, classics, and philosophy in Marburg, Jerusalem, and Munich, and received his doctorate in 1991 and Habilitation in 1994 from the University of Tübingen. The recipient of multiple honorary doctorates, his many publications include such seminal works as Valentinus 1992, Ambrosius von Mailand und die Trinitätstheologie in 1995, Diagnosis in 2001, Kaiser Zeitlicher christliche Theologie und ihre Institutionen, for the Dominance zu einer Geschichte der antiken christlichen Theologie in 2007, and a volume of Gesammeltes Studium Origen and Paul in 2007. 2 volumes in 2007, after stepping down as the president of the Humboldt-Universität. One of my favorite books, which some of the students here have read, I'm sure, in addition to knowing his name. One of my favorite books to teach with is an earlier, smaller book entitled Christian den Brandenburg, Doctorate des Antiques Christentums, which was translated into English in 1999 as Between Two Worlds, Structures of Early Christianity, a really marvelous study that encompasses a great broad range of thoughts about the structure and the logic of early Christian religion. Among positions of academic leadership and honor, Professor Markschies is a member of the Akademia of Erfurt and Heidelberg, of the European Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the Akademia Europea. He is also vice president of the Brandenburg Academy of Sciences and Humanities. And of a particular interest to us, from 1999 to 2010, he was the director of the Academy project on which we all depend, Die griechischen christlichen Schriftsteller der ersten Jahrhunderte, the GCS editions that are the very basis for much of our work. And he's currently involved in a project with the Academy on Alexandrian and Antiochian biblical interpretation in late antiquity. For the GCS, he is currently completing, I hope I am not speaking out of turn, a critical edition that is sorely needed of Origen's fragments on 1 Corinthians, for which we depend still on the Jenkins from JTS from 1910 and 11. And also a monograph on the body of God that will appear first in German and then in English from Princeton University Press. Professor Markschies' work to date brilliantly integrates the things that most matter to us in our work as scholars of ancient Christianity: rigorous and exacting philology, broad and deep and rich engagement with the intellectual, philosophical, and theological traditions of emergent Christianity, Judaism in late antiquity, and the broad traditional disciplines of the Greco-Roman world, and the full disciplines that we bring in the contemporary world out of the humanistic studies to ancient Christianity. He is a leader and advocate for the humanities and for the study of religion within them, and has been such as president of the Humboldt-Universität, and also just in the very scholarship that he does that commands respect across many corners of many universities. So it is a great honor to welcome you to this university. This afternoon, Professor Markschies' talk is entitled Origen and Paul, The Example of Their Anthropologies. Please join me in welcoming Professor Markschies to the University of Chicago.
Thank you for the very warm welcome. It's a great pleasure to be here and also a great honor. Seen from outside, Chicago's Divinity School was coined from the beginning on by a serious interest in manifold dimensions of living religion. And this in a time when in Germany the history of ancient Christianity was conceptualized as a mere history of ideas. It is the history of Christian dogma, or as the political history of a struggle between two entities like blocks of marble, the Roman Empire and the Christian Church. Also prominent Chicago professors like Edgar Johnson Goodspeed and others were trained or studied in Germany and adopted leading paradigms and coining methods of German ältere Kirchengeschichte, ancient church history. The curriculum of Chicago's Divinity School in those early years seems to someone coming from Berlin to you far more open and open-minded than the curriculum of Berlin's Faculty of Divinity in those days. Goodspeed adopted, obviously, the idea that critical text editions are the fundamental basis of every historiographical work, also of historiographical work on the subject of religion. When he, 1898, moved for postgraduate studies to Germany and especially to Berlin 2 years, Harnack was the leading figure of German church historians. But surprisingly to me, in Goodspeed's edition of Ancient Christian Apologetics, ältere christliche Apologeten, of the year 1914, 100 years ago, Harnack's own groundbreaking work, for example on Justin, the Parisian manuscript of Christian apologetics, the Codex Aretas, and others of his contributions to the field are more or less neglected, not mentioned, overlooked, as you like. I'm not an expert and not really familiar with the personal theology of the Northern Baptist minister Edgar Johnson Goodspeed to explain why he published his Editio Critica Minor of the Apologists and his 2 indices of the Apostolic Fathers and the Apologists outside the GCS series, the Berlin Church Father Corpus, griechische christliche Schriftsteller, and why his own editorial work, groundbreaking work, we are still using this mentioned edition, why his own groundbreaking editorial work was, on the other side, more or less neglected when the editors in Berlin were looking for colleagues to edit the Christian apologists in the Berlin Church Father Corpus. Über die Apologeten wurde nichts verhandelt, da diese Ausgabe keine Eile hat. There were no discussions about the apologists because this specific edition isn't really urgent. Harnack noted in April 1910 into the minutes of the editor's board of GCS. the Berlin Church Father corpus 4 years before Goodstreet published his edition. Also, the subject of today's lecture, Origen and Paul, the Example of Their Anthropologies, sounds a little bit old-fashioned, like an example for classical German history of dogma. I don't want today to continue those, shall I say, bad traditions of neglecting different approaches from other countries. I would like, on the contrary, take up the challenge of a specific Chicago interest in socio-historical method. Also, Goodstreet himself was not fully committed to the socio-historical method, and this fact should prevent us from generalizations such as I have developed during the last minutes, and deal with an often dealt subject, the relation between Paul the Apostle and Origen, the first polymath of the Christian theological tradition, an often dealt subject in a slightly new way. I'm announcing modestly a slightly new way, using a new paradigm. There are lots of papers, articles and monographs on the relation of Paul the Apostle and Origen, the first Christian polymath in the 3rd century, on the basis of a traditional history of dogma paradigm. Not necessary to mention one of these or all of them this afternoon. It seems to me, and this is the specific approach of my Chicago lecture, it seems to me that we can make some significant progress on a central point of the description of this relation, Origen and Paul, if we employ a paradigm developed in part, or at least furthered in this development here in Chicago, namely the paradigm of systems of knowledge, Wissensordnung, systems of knowledge interpreted as a fluid network. You can imagine the outline of my talk this afternoon in light of my thesis. I will first begin with some brief remarks on the definition of the term systems of knowledge, Wissensordnung, at which central point of the description of the relationship between Origen and Paul this paradigm can be of use to us. Then, drawing on the field of anthropology, I will explain how with the aid of this paradigm, I formulate this with deliberate restraint, we can at least be more perceptive of the evident ambivalence in Origen's interpretation of Paul, more open to describing the breaks, the unwieldiness and contradictions of his texts, and avoiding blurring distinctions for a variety of reasons. A final third section of my talk posits a few consequences of my observations for the study of religion and for religious existence today, to borrow a phrase from long ago, albeit not nearly so long ago as the days of Origen. Systems of knowledge are a popular topic nowadays. By knowledge, to formulate a bare-bones working definition, I mean some part of the entirety of all reality-interpreting description of elements of that reality. Probably I should repeat against the noise again in the definition. By knowledge, I mean some part of the entirety of all reality, interpreting description of all elements of that reality, where reality is simply understood as something which is not perceived simply as a possibility, but with which something real is asserted. With the term systems of knowledge, Wissensordnung, I'm describing a systematic ordering of knowledge associated with a particular validity claim. If knowledge only ever exists in multi-dimensional relations, in which, for instance, mental and epistemic structures overlap, Origen knows something, and Origen knows something. It becomes clear that systematization or ordering consists in a particular arrangement of knowledge according to certain of its individual relations. Such a systematization or ordering of knowledge into a knowledge system can occur in two fundamental different ways, either in the form of a hierarchy, such as in a hierarchy tree, or in the form of a network of essentially decentralized plural nodes or foci. In an important article titled Was ist Wissensgeschichte? What is History of Knowledge? Philip Sarrazin described how in a modern conception of the history of knowledge systems are viewed not as hierarchical structures of more useful and less useful, more important and less important, permitted and forbidden knowledge, as in previous centuries, but rather as networks of bodies of knowledge in which the focus is placed here or there based on circumstances. Thus, knowledge systems are comparable to neural networks in the brain, in which, rather than some central control center that determines the hierarchy of all processes, neutral circuitry emerges in decentralized processes develop and pathways perpetuate themselves. Sarrazin draws attention to the fact that there is not one single hierarchical system of knowledge in a society because, as he says, I quote, knowledge circulates between people and groups, because in the space of semiotic systems and discourses, semantic content possesses the potency to transcend institutional, social, political, and geographic boundaries. As an aside, I would like to note that in the practice of transdisciplinary cooperation, it is a matter of principle to critically evaluate paradigms developed in neighboring disciplines before we apply them. Sarrazin believes that it is possible to strictly distinguish between knowledge systems and religions or belief systems. He defines A. Knowledge systems as systems of largely rationally founded, empirically testable hypotheses and theories, as well as the fields of knowledge and subject areas principally ascribed to the sciences. And B. Religion or belief systems including a non-transcendental character. It has convictions, interpretations of the world, ideologies, as well as norms, rules, and law, which are not at all or only minimally founded on or explainable by rational argumentative means. When we shortly took a close look at Origen, we will quickly see that he, and of course many other Christian theologians before and after him, did everything in his power to perforate the boundary seemingly so strictly drawn by Sarrazin and justify his convictions and interpretations of the world on rational grounds, although they were not empirically testable in a strict sense. I use the term seemingly because in a subsequent section of the text to which I refer, Sarrazin very clearly states that knowledge and belief systems can only be delineated pragmatically. Systems of knowledge are not permanently hierarchically organized structures, but rather decentralized networks of knowledge. If we concern ourselves today with the relationship of the Paul interpreter Origen to the object of his interpretation, the Apostle Paul and his writings, we are therefore investigating in detail in the network of knowledge that is passed down to us in Origen's writings, preserved in the form of Origen's texts. Origen has knowledge of the Apostle and his theology, and he uses that knowledge to authorize, to correct and transform other bodies of knowledge when he illustrates or substantiates his theological statements with Pauline citations. The term network is also appropriate in that, of course, these two processes, which I have just artificially distinguished, cannot be separated. Obviously, no one, to borrow some modern terminology, works out his exegetic interpretation of one of Paul's passages in purely theoretical terms, entirely uninfluenced by his fundamental systematic theological position. Likewise, no one asserts his fundamental systematic theological positions entirely uninfluenced by which I will call, borrowing the currently highly controversial formulation, the self-movement of a biblical text. That self-movement is capable of asserting some form of sense, even in contradiction to the interpretative intention of the interpreter. It's clear to me that here I should provide a more detailed explanation of why I kick against the goals of post-structuralism and Julie White's constructivist views, but I'm concerned here with Paul and Origen, not Foucault and Derrida. I do agree with this hermeneutic school, in any case, that in the networks of knowledge, the different strategies of knowledge acquisition, such as that which we today regard as the exegetic, the systematic theological, are closely connected. Previous generations in Germany, naturally not just in Germany, spoke of the hermeneutic circle. Sarrazin writes in the aforementioned paper, knowledge is therefore always hybrid. Even in the well-founded scientific systems, there are always more or less clear traces of the origins of the cultural, political, or social conditions of existence and the specific means of application of knowledge. This origin of knowledge, however, determines in a certain sense the fact of the knowledge acquisition. Also, there are naturally methodologies to avoid arbitrariness in the process. For example, in the interpretation of texts using a universally recognized method. This would be an appropriate point at which to discuss the rather more infamous, in Protestant circles, than famous method of multiple interpretations, multiple senses of scripture of Origen, and posited, contrary to misinterpretation, as a procedure in line not only with the contemporary ancient rationality standards of hermeneutics, but I'll leave that for another time in the interest of the subject before. The focus of our attention remains the question of how a certain concept of systems of knowledge helps us better understand the relationship between Origen and Paul. But how much does this more or less new paradigm of systems of knowledge aid us at a central point in the description of the relationship between Origen and Paul? Most of us here know that the explanation of this relationship is generally handled as a special case of a more general relationship, namely the relationship of biblical theology and Platonic philosophy in the thinking of the Alexandrine theologians. It should not, for now at any rate, surprise us that in such reconstructions, biblical theology and Platonic philosophy are construed as two stable entities, completely autonomous of one another, as if they were two blocks of marble in the landscape clearly visible to the observer. That is not the case has actually been clear from the start. The Zurich dissertation on Neoplatonic and Christian theology in Synesius of Cyrene, defended by Samuel Vollenweider in 1983 and published in 1985, the problems of the requisite images of the Christian are explained with succinct precision as a perfect example of the aforementioned hermeneutic circle. But back to the relationship of biblical theology and Platonic philosophy in Origen. One need not, as Ulrich Werner did in 1981 in his volume Origenes in Erträge der Forschung, a short history of research in Origen in a small German series, comb through the entirety of the secondary literature of Alexandrian theology collected in two massive volumes to recognize that a bitter dispute is being waged in the scholarship as to how the two knowledge systems, biblical theology on one hand and Platonic philosophy on the other, are hierarchized in the case of Origen. On the one hand, there are very simple models. My own Catholic teacher in Tübingen, Hermann Josef Vogt, was a persistent proponent of the basic dogma of the Catholic French Origen scholarship, whereby the Christian Alexandrian was acknowledged to be well versed in philosophy, but supposed to have remained loyal to biblical morals in all cases of conflict between biblical texts and Platonic philosophy. For Vogt, as for Henri Cousel, for example, the following image of Origen applies. in the knowledge system of the Alexandrian theologian, biblical, theological, and Platonic philosophical systems are clearly hierarchized. In Crusal's and Völk's conception, Origen is at core a biblical theologian. The counter-model to this interpretation was not coincidentally asserted by Protestant theologians, such as the Reformed French theologian Eugène de Failly, in a major 3-volume work from the years 1923 to 28. Origen was the first Christian thinker, according to de Failly, to introduce basic concepts of imperial Platonic philosophy, so-called Middle Platonic philosophy, into the interpretation of the Christian Bible and thus into theology. In fact, he was much more committed, according to Failly, to philosophical concepts like the two-world doctrine, the greater significance of spiritual being over material reality, and so on, than to biblical concepts. Of course, there were always moderating concepts floating around, and even Cruzel and de Failly were not as radically one-sided as I have portrayed them here for reasons of economy and illustration. The most appealing example of such a middle way comes to us by way of Adolf von Harnack's very late article on Origen in the second edition of the Protestant Encyclopedia Die Religion in Geschichte und Gegenwart, not translated as the last one, Religion in Past and Present, which appeared in the 4th volume in the year of Harnack's death in 1930. On the one hand, Harnack emphasizes that with his philosophical theology, Origen had presented, I quote, merely a variation of the post-Platonic Stoic system, and speculated in a rather elevated fashion on biblical texts in the orbit of these philosophical orientations. On the other hand, Harnack is wise enough to see that the speculation is, I quote him, bound in its understanding of the Bible to the rule of faith, which the Church, following in the apostolic tradition, developed from the Bible according to Origen, in contrast to the false understanding of the heretics. The rule of faith, regula fidei or canon tes pisteos, is the formulation of basic truth of the Christian faith, such as the affirmation of one God, the one Christ, and the one Church. And then Harnack gives us a wonderful picture. The Church Gnostic is like an airship man who does indeed lift off and rise up to the sun, but his balloon is a captive balloon that can never lose contact with the firm ground of the rule of faith. However, one defines the relationship between biblical theology and Platonic philosophy in Origen. The system of knowledge of these Alexandrian theologians or Christian was commonly described as a hierarchy of bodies of knowledge separated like two static blocks. The distinction of the worldly Bible interpretation based on the rule of faith, the regula fidei, from the high-flown, ethereal, or nebulous speculation in Harnack is perhaps the clearest metaphor for the modeling of bodies of knowledge as separate entities, and knowledge systems as strictly hierarchical systems. If we now describe knowledge systems In the context of recent history of knowledge, for which we have named Philip Sarrazin, you can name a lot of interesting philosophers also from this wonderful university, much more as a continuously reconfigured network of fluid hierarchizations. This also changes the description of the relationship of biblical theology and Platonic philosophy in Origen, as opposed to the conventional conceptualizations of the 20th century as represented by Cruzel and Vogt on one hand, de Failly, and with some reservations Harnack on the other hand. A somewhat flippant response to the question of whether Origen was loyal to the Bible or Plato's philosophy then would be it depended. It depended, for instance, on whether or not the ancient exegete and thinker even perceived a conflict that we presume to perceive today. It depended on the context in which he was currently writing, and sometimes on the, as Sarrazin puts it, forms of representation and mediality of the knowledge. Or to put it somewhat more concisely, in sermons, Origen platonized less than in the famous doctrinal tractate Periarchon, De Principiis. But the sermons were also directed at ordinary members of the congregation of a port and provincial city, in the Mediterranean, and the statement of principles was presumably the concluding lecture at Origen's private university, an attempt tailored to students to present a summary of all systems of knowledge against the backdrop of the concept of God, creation, and revelations, including an appropriate understanding thereof. Put another way, sermons are intended as an invitation to non-academics, if I may once again use an anachronistic formulation, an invitation to non-academics to read the Bible, and as a guide to independent study of what they have heard in the church service. In the lecture hall, by contrast, Origen students are intended to grasp that the pagan educational canon is not only in tune with the Christian theology, Origen still refers to it as Christian philosophy, but is at the same time framed by it and brings it into a truly comprehensive, compelling, and proper system. Or, in other words, that it can be presented and learned in the theoretically positive, hierarchical knowledge system intended by God. Now we can proceed after a short last quarter. Now we can proceed to the second shorter part of this talk, and finally concern ourselves with the relationship between Origen and Paul based on the example of their anthropologies. For a variety of self-evident reasons, I will concentrate only on one commentary, on one of the large number of fragmentary preserved texts of Origen. Thus, I will not be dealing with the homilies on the first epistle to the Corinthians, which I have been attempting to edit for years from fragments of Catini, but rather the commentary on the Epistle of the Romans, outstandingly edited by Caroline Bummel from Cambridge, which, however, is only available to us in the abridged and dogmatically corrected, updated Latin translation by Rufinus of Aquileia, and in some Greek fragments, primarily from Byzantine Catini commentaries, they're already mentioned. This translation was completed in 406 and abridged 15 books into 10. There is something to the old stereotype that the Greeks were more abundant and the Latins briefer. To tap once more into, if only in jest, the ever so popular folk psychologies so beloved of the ancient, though we know them to be highly problematic today. Origen wrote this commentary in 243 to 44, some 150 years before Rufinus translated it, at which time he had already been living, preaching and teaching in Caesarea for around 10 years. It was then the mature lay work of a nearly 60-year-old former grammar teacher who had long since become a renowned theological teacher and highly respected academic instructor throughout the entire empire, as the exuberant commencement speech by his pupil Gregor Thaumaturgos shows. As for Origen's commentary on Romans as an ancient commentary, and the method of interpretation employed there, I have dealt with that elsewhere in a collected volume which can most edited, so always UChicago. Elsewhere, I can simply point to that work for future reference, so that we can now concentrate on Origen, Paul, and the respective anthropology on the basis of his Romans commentary. To examine the relationship of Origen and Paul, it must first be made clear that Origen venerated the apostle, his epistles, and his theology. In his major refutation of the long dead but still influential philosopher Celsus, composed shortly after his Romans commentary, Origen says, I quote, Paul then, we are to suppose, had before his mind the idea of no preeminent wisdom when he professed to speak wisdom among them that are perfect. Now, as he Celsus spoke with his customary boldness when in making such a profession, he said that he, Paul, was possessed of no wisdom, we shall say in reply, quoting Origen, first of all examine the epistles of him who utter these words, Paul, and look carefully at the meaning of each expression in them. Say, in those to the Ephesians and Colossians and Thessalonians and Philippians and Romans, and show two things. Both that you understand Paul's words, and that you can demonstrate any of them to be silly or foolish. For if anyone give himself to their attentive perusal, I'm not assured either that he will be amazed at the understanding of the man who can clothe great ideas in common language, or if he be not amazed, he will only exhibit himself in a ridiculous light. Inasmuch as we must recognize the fact that Origen venerates the object of his interpretation, the apostle and his epistles, as he openly admits, it must also be noted that he found the epistle to the Romans in particular, I quote, difficult to understand, as he states in the foreword to his Romans commentary. This signifies more than the assurance typical of commentary prologues that the subject is difficult and can only be properly understood with the help of the Holy Spirit. or the muse in pagan Rome. According to Origen, Paul sometimes has an unclear manner of speaking and does not express everything. Moreover, in this epistle, as Origen also says in the prologue to his Romans commentary, he is evidently more righteous than in the others. While in the Philippians and 1 Corinthians he acknowledges that he still lacks some of the righteousness that he later achieved, or rather points out that he is still a work in progress. His understanding is already more righteous in his letters to the Corinthians, and all the more so in Romans. Righteousness refers not only to an especially upstanding or virtuous life by the standards of antiquity, but by the standards of antiquity, but to the rejection of central material ungodly things and the pursuit of the divine spiritual worth, as Origen formulates it in what we call the Platonic word dualism. Also, this influenced the perception of very many people in antiquity. Paul is righteous in writing Romans, and what that means for Origen is Paul does not look back to the central work, is not distracted from contemplating godly things by it. He does not wander from the Apostle Paul to the buffet to update Origen somewhat for current realities in Chicago. Because the interpreters and even the ascetic Origen can only follow the apostles stumblingly along this path led by the Holy Spirit, to whom Paul prays repeatedly, and because Paul deals with so many vital problems in Romans, the apostolic work is difficult to understand. Now, if we apply all of this to our paradigm of systems of knowledge, Origen is certain that there is a well-ordered hierarchical system of knowledge in Paul, but he's not sure that he has exhaustively described it in his commentary. In spite of certain pride, unfortunately still characteristic of academics today, in the solidity of his methodology, the extent of his erudition and his familiarity with the biblical text, which, by the way, is so vast that occasionally something is cited from memory and attributed to the wrong epistle of Paul in the introduction. At the same, Origen knows that humility on the part of the interpreter is a central prerequisite for successfully understanding texts, but also God and the Word strives for such humility and attributes its lack to philosophy. Now let us take a closer but shorter look at the anthropology. When looking at Origen, indubitably belongs among the aforementioned particularly weighty theological problems that Paul raises, discusses and addresses in Romans, and whose treatment and resolution could only be adequately represented and commented upon by a similarly righteous interpreter. One problem in Origen's Romans commentary is less the fundamental composition of men out of mind, body, and soul as a medium between them, than the freedom with which the thus constituted person can behave in regard to God's law, or indeed not at all. I would like to examine this problem in greater detail, as here the Pauline and Platonic and indeed Stoic elements can be so easily traced in Origen thinking, or rather the systems of knowledge. It can be shown that Origen reads his Pauline text firm in the belief that man is free in his decisions, even in the choice for or against God. And thus that he comes into strong conflict by our modern standards with the deterministic inclinations, in particular of the 7th and 9th chapter of Romans. But the issue is not quite as simple as was assumed in the old block scheme of somehow hierarchizing conflict between a biblical, or more precisely Pauline, deterministic, and a philosophical, or more precisely Platonic, freedom of will anthropology with Stoic elements. At the outset, Origen manages in the first and second book of his Romans commentary to speak in a very Pauline attitude of the power of sin. For example, when he paints the elegant picture of man as a house, in which before two doors of the soul, desire and virtue seek entry. If virtue is spurned, it retreats, offended, leaving the fool man to sink into his desires, as Paul describes it at the beginning of Romans. The incandescent image of man who is free to decide, which Origen draws especially in his commentary on Romans chapter 7, and axiomatically predicates on certain philosophical systems, is all but absent at the beginning of the Romans commentary. Perhaps it can be said that in the network of knowledge that Origen shapes, occasionally, under the strong influence of the Pauline texts he reveres, their anthropological concepts move forcefully into the foreground and overcome other concepts derived from Platonic and Stoic philosophy. It depends. In other places, or as Sarrazin would say, in other contexts, the network of knowledge can be organized completely differently. I have already mentioned how Origen, in the 6th book of his Romans commentary, axiomatically affirms the freedom of man to choose for or against God. Man is made in the image of God and is, for that reason alone, free. He is responsible towards God and also free for that reason. Only Gnostic heresies can set determination or even predestination in place of the freedom to choose. How then does Origen explain the passages in which Paul speaks of being incapable of achieving the good, also the will to do so is there? For the good that I want, I do not do, but practice the very evil that I do not want. Origen applies a common method of the literary hermeneutics of the pagan school of interpretation and methodology. He used the prosopopoieta, the differentiation of personae, and commented the respective sentence thus, I quote, "As a teacher of church, Paul assumes even the role of the weak." Paul speaks in the guise of several personae, and thus uses a conventional literary device. Thus, Origen viewed his interpretation of the 7th chapter of Romans not as a philosophical reshaping of Pauline theology, with a particular position on the question of man's freedom to choose, let alone against the literal sense of the epistle to the Romans, but as the result of a literary analysis, the identification of prosopopoieta, person. Speaking in the form of multiple personae, and thus link various bodies of knowledge, as we would say today, literary, philosophical, and theological, to a form of context-related, hierarchy-free, decentralized network of a system of knowledge, which could here, as well as the commentary on the 1st chapter of Romans, have turned out differently. It depended. It's time for me to wrap up. However much I would enjoy elaborating on the picture I have described, all too brief. For example, by taking in greater detail other texts of Origen. We do not have the time. But I did promise to draw some conclusions for the present, for religious studies and religion itself. But I can do that very briefly. Because it is very simple. We must, at this profitable application of the results of the science of knowledge shows us, take an even more interdisciplinary approach to study. We should also think about whether the openness with which Origen, in interpreting the Bible, configures his system of knowledge as a fluid network depending on the context, might not also take on a greater role in the organization and content-based focus of our current studies than the familiar term early church history, Germany familiar term, might suggest. Antiquity is not over. It is just past presence. Thank you very much. I think I should start with the last question. I'm understandable without the microphone. There were traces of interest in sociology of knowledge when I was describing describing the different levels of learning in the recipients of Origen's texts. When I have spoken about the hearers of his sermons, which were obviously not very learned people, also Origen imagined them as learned people. He often concluded sermons with a wonderful sentence, go at home and read in the Bible. 9% of the people were able to read texts according to Harris. So the question is how many people in Origen's community were able, but my impression is that the way in which Origen reorganized his different elements in his system of knowledge were depending of the context, and the social context is one of these criteria for organizing. So, for example, philosophical knowledge is more or less restricted to the lectures designed for learned people in his private university in Caesarea. And on the other side, the whole language is far more simple in the sermons. So I think, and also your second question concerning rhetoric, these were dimensions of my model in describing of Origen, which I haven't mentioned. So rhetoric is one of the key elements for a grammar teacher, and he's using them, and so reorganizing the system of knowledge and putting rhetoric on the top, if you have the impression, that helps to understand. So it's a question of sociology. The term prosopopolia is probably never checked, but I'm quite sure, never mentioned in his homilies, because no one sitting in front. These were, Origen was preaching, he had wonderful information for a group of around 30 people near the harbor. Of course, he's from time to time picking up the noise, not in the air, but in the harbor, in the port, and saying, now we have the ship was coming, and we hear the people dealing with the ship. And so there are different elements in this system of knowledge. I have mentioned some rhetoric, I have to confess, was not overlooked, not neglected, not mentioned enough. In which way he is arranging the system depends on the auditory. This is a question of sociology, a question of rhetoric, and so on.
Just on this point, the prosopopoia is Origen's answer to a particular question, right? And his answer is the lusus et prosopon. It's the solution by appeal to the prosopon. And then to answer that, he says, this prosopon cannot be taught. So, but before you even get to the lusus, you have a structure of knowledge, or a structure of kind of transactional knowledge of the thema kailuses, right? That the approach to biblical text is, what are the problem questions for disputation, and then what are the possible solutions? And I wonder whether, when you think about these networks of knowledge, that one of the, if it's not a hierarchical move, it's at least a background-foreground move, that the operative zethema here is, in this case, the prosopon. And then in another case, it may be the definition of freedom or something else. So how do you think about that with the network theory of knowledge? The question is, from where do the questions come? And are there hierarchies or forms of prominence among the questions that drive the pursuit of knowledge in particular directions and maybe not in others?
My impression is that Origen is so well familiar with the biblical text that from time to time, not always, the biblical text reconfigures the hierarchy with which he is coming to the text and reading the text. And these are the most interesting things. When I try to explain it, things which were explained in the traditional research to Origen as the confused professor, not consistent, or these wonderful questions, is he a systematic theologian with a consistent theory or not? I don't think or it's possible model to describe or not, but he, from time to time, he's really coined by the idea that biblical texts are dealing with some problems. And the inventory of the problems is a fixed one, definitely. But in which way this inventory of problems was constituted by reading the Bible and commenting. So it's the wonderful metaphor foreground and background. So it's like in a wonderful theater evening, foreground and background are always changing. Like in the theater, the question why the foreground is taken back by the people in the theater is the text. And it's the biblical text, but also the text of his philosophical knowledge, of his rhetorical knowledge, and so lots of questions. Perhaps first on the right side and then the left.
When you opened a lot of questions in your lecture, and it's hard to see where one could start getting into the setup that we offered here. Things are from the biblical perspective much more complicated. Now, to what extent do you talk about the theology of Paul is an open question. All knowledge is, of course, historical. And this is also true of science. There was a time when things were not known. And through discovery, development, and experiment, and so forth, they are. And I think in principle is the same truth also about the Bible, which is not a concept that is found in the Bible. And theology of Paul, which is very contested what it is. Now there is also a historical aspect, an historical aspect in the theology of Paul, namely that not all of his letters say the same thing. And it is also that Paul learns from one letter to the next. And so his own thinking is an evolvement that depends on the confrontation with people like the Corinthians who pose questions to him that he was not fully prepared to answer from the beginning. He had to develop arguments on the spot to answer these questions. And of course, these answers may not be the same answers that he gave before. And therefore, between Galatians' view of Judaism and Romans is a tremendous step and difference. Both as a Christian theologian and as a Jewish theologian, he develops these ideas from one letter to the other. So also Paul's Paulinism is something that has a history. then, to ask what is the system in their history is a big question. The system in the history would be probably the way of his thinking, but that's very difficult to define and to isolate what is. And the same is true probably of Origen.
The wonderful thing is you, in a nutshell, develop a kind of side lecture to my lecture. I try to argue why we should avoid constructing Origen as someone combining two blocks, the theology of Paul and the Platonic theology. Now you develop a side lecture why it is not sensible to construct the Marburg block, the theology of Paul. I remember the wonderful moment when we read your commentary on Galatians when I was a young student in the first semester in Marburg. The whole way in Marburg before the theology of Paul was shaped to a certain extent was differentiated. But I think your insights in the history of the development of Paul thinking could be also reframed with a paradigm system of knowledge. Of course, these were letters in certain situations, and this is also, again, the foreground, background model. If there is some problem, I have to bring things in the foreground, and these were not, these are the limits of the theater metaphor. In the theater, we have every evening the same in the foreground and in the background. And the rearrangements, reconfigures not only the hierarchies, but also the knowledge. So it's more fluid than what is presented at a stage.
I just want to know a bit about where the Saracen, the network metaphor, where did he go for that? Because there are a number of different contexts that could supply the image, or the details, the notions of what the operators are or how things shift. So does he identify a particular contemporary context for that metaphor?
I think the metaphor is used, as I have said, in the neurologist's description of the brain. So the idea is that there is not one single room in which the whole process of the brain is controlled, but it's a kind of linked network in there from different parts or aisles of the network. Things were done, and the whole network this is what Hans-Peter Betz said. There's a kind of structure in which the network functions. Logic, for example, but also these things are developing. The question how God fits to the rules of logic is one of these methods. Basic methodological structures according to which the network is reorganized or questioned by the network.
Thank you very much for your very enlightening lecture. And I actually initially had the question that Professor Betz asked about whether the problem of whether there is already such a thing as a biblical theology for Origen is antecedent to the two Marburg blocks. But I liked your way of handling that and the fluidity. But following up on that question and going to theory of knowledge, you use Saracen, but what about Thomas Kuhn? Would you see Origen as a paradigm shift in either the history of exegesis or theology?
Definitely, yes. Because Origen, as we see, this is always the wonderful ancient question of Solanus. I don't know the English term, the German term is Häufisches. How many trees make a forest? This is difficult to answer, but all we were convinced that this is not a forest, but a number of trees. There were people well trained, rugby, for example. But I think that there is a new step in quality in Origen. Dan Neuschel, wonderful, fully shown that he used all the instruments developed in Alexandria. This is so wonderful to see how he is using these instruments without any, how to say, from time to time, without any success in understanding the text. In the commentary of Matthew, when the earthquake after Jesus' crucifixion was mentioned, he said, oh, I checked all the minutes about earthquakes, and then he was naming the earthquakes, and then he's saying, but I have to confess, this earthquake is not mentioned, and then leaving a lot of things working, and another one of the things our daily bread gives us today, that it was obviously he brought the commentaries together in dictating them, and he took obviously from the bookshelves a dictionary with 9 possible understandings of the Greek term zero from the Stoic dictionary. And then, surprisingly, he missed to relate which of the 9 is now fitting meaning to understand Hypoousios. And obviously, I'm always explaining this with the fact that if you're dictating and going to one side and then to the next side and not looking to the text which is dictated, then it's difficult to continue the line of thinking. So definitely this is the new paradigm, because he's the first one who is well trained in all disciplines and fields of academic knowledge, and so his commentaries reach a new step and were fully comparable or meet the standards of contemporary text writers.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you. My question is sort of a follow-up on Dean's question about the source of the questions for the biblical text of Origen. I wonder if you could return to the example of his little argument with Celsus about it seems that Celsus is pushing Origen to take a side in the hierarchical system, right? He's being asked to choose whether Paul is philosophically intelligible or not. I wonder if you think that Origen does sometimes fall into that hierarchical model, just flipping what Celsus is offering, or if he still maintains the sort of network model that you offer.
Very good question. I think in every network is, in a specific moment, a hierarchy. Brain. It's one single nerve who is firing all these networks. So that network hierarchy is not a strict proposition in the dualistic sense. And I think this was not quite clear in my paper. This was the reason why I was thinking some seconds. I must be clearer in that when I'm talking about hierarchy, I'm talking about the traditional model. There is a clear and fixed hierarchy based on a dualistic concept, and the question is loyal to philosophy or to the Bible. Is there the Bible always the top of this hierarchy? This was the model I had in mind when I was talking about hierarchy. As Klaus said, when taking up the rhetorical model of prosopophoria, then there is a hierarchy. He made the decision it's better to understand by using a rhetorical term, not, I don't know, another sentence in the Bible or whatever, or the dictionary of meanings of the word, I don't know, freedom, or whatever. The interesting question is what motivates him. This was your question, to reconfigure actually. And there is not only social reasons, people sitting in front of him, but also that he is provoked by someone attacking him. The person attacking him, to a certain extent, is establishing a tunnel towards directly his interests. Definitely, yes. This is the problem if I'm arguing in a polemical way. The possibility of possible arrangements is restricted by someone else.
I'm still wrapping my head around systems of thinking, and so this is an attempt to request some elaboration to help me in that. Is it, in this particular theater metaphor, is it in the spirit of your positing of the term to say something like the following, that rather than speaking of tragedy, we should speak of the tragedy that is Hamlet, where what's being stipulated is that the claim for generic classification is worrisome to the degree that it involves a particular example in question of its unique qualities. So we have to posit the system in some sense. We always immediately have to qualify it by the particularity. If that's right, which I take the conditional seriously, then when later in your lecture you say words like stoicism, I'm imagining that by referring to them as systems of thought, you have in mind a particular example of stoicism rather than system. And so if you could walk me, I may be seriously misconstrued, but I'm wondering about the analogy of that.
You're completely right. I hope that the term stoicism only appears in citations. Because Harnack had a wonderful idea. He was not very familiar with the ongoing debate in the history of philosophy. I would try sociology to link such terms, as you have said, with concrete sociological entities, philosopher X and his auditory there and there. I think the network theory of knowledge also helps to, it's necessary for, I think, simple reasons of academic teaching to build up certain types of philosophy. In the academic teaching, it's impossible, and German term consists of, I think, 16 hours. So it's not possible in the framework of a department of divinity to present the whole picture of possible forms of Stoicism in the 3rd century, but one has to present some characteristics. But in the academic publications, indeed it's necessary first to present a variety and then ask the question, are there some common features which allows us to go out? And God's body, there are clear-cut distinctions between Platonic and Stoic thinkers in the 3rd, not in the 4th century. Stoics were quite convinced that there is nothing spiritual, no idea without corporeal reality. Platonic thinkers were convinced until the Neo-Platonists suddenly were convinced that there is a heavenly body of soul. This is a wonderful thing that things crashed in late antiquity completely. Boundaries crashed down. Neo-Platonists were discussing the question, what about the heavenly body of soul and service incarnate? Heavenly body is waiting for this newly created. So indeed, I think one has always to look very Aristotelian or communal ways in between. To avoid, I had a wonderful discussion with a German philosopher called Flasch. And Flasch said there are no periods in history. Yes, definitely. There is no one in history written now Middle Ages periods. But I have to start the lectures at the beginning of a term, not somewhere, but to argue for why I'm starting there, and I have to argue for why I'm ending at a certain point, and it's not possible to continue and to continue and to continue. No one would be sitting in the room. This, and at the same time, present different concepts of the Middle Ages and the possibility to start there and there. And for that reason, I'm using this as starting point. This seems to me a reasonable way in between.
If I may challenge another aspect of the paper, maybe these blocks of that are assumed in past research of biblical thought and theology versus Plato. There is one element of structure that I think is common between Paul's way of thinking and Plato's way of thinking. And that is the altercation between questions that are being asked Paul and he recognizes as legitimate and he develops an answer. So that method was invented doctorate, popularized by Plato, and it continues until basically today. Now, does Origen think in those terms as well?
Definitely.
He does. So it's not the only motivation.
Sorry?
Attack is not the only motivation for a question.
No. I think Origen was fully aware that to a certain extent philosophy is a method which one can use to understand texts and more than texts, entities, words, and so far. But he was convinced that there is a clear neighborhood between chords in the Bible and chords in the. He is obviously the first Christian theologian who was familiar with Alexandrian lectures about Platonic dialogues. He was the first one. Interesting question. I would like to modify. He was very familiar and also presenting his own solutions to questions debated in the lectures. This is perhaps more precise. And because of this knowledge, he was convinced that there is a certain neighborhood. But he also realized in some cases that there were problems. But one has to see he was using a translation of the Bible in which also a lot of philosophical concepts were brought in. He was not dealing with Mehrfisch, but with decay. So he had a philological ground in what he was doing.
So we have a reception prepared downstairs and carry out the conversation with some libations and some food. But please let's thank Professor Markschies.
We thank you for listening to or viewing our podcast. For more information and for other podcasts, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts. Copyright, the University of Chicago Divinity School.